In the words of the psalmist, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable to you, O Lord, our rock and our redeemer. David and the whole company of Israel were in the parade, singing at the top of their lungs and playing mandolins, harps, tambourines, castanets, and cymbals. I believe we can guess what brought David such great joy that he danced as he accompanied the Ark of the Covenant to its new home in Jerusalem. He danced because the Ark contained the divine presence. I wonder what gives us such great joy that we want to dance. When do we experience God's presence? How can we experience God's presence? This is the theme I want to explore this morning. I've had the privilege over the last several months of visiting an elderly gentleman who had a diagnosis of terminal cancer. And the last time I visited him was in a hospice. And I have permission to share part of our conversation. I asked him what brought joy to his life. And he quickly replied, his late wife who predeceased him, his wife and daughter, and his career all brought him great joy. As soon as I asked the question, he immediately knew what brought joy to his life. David danced with joy when he accompanied the Ark of the Covenant. He danced because he experienced the presence of God. When do we dance, or what causes us to be filled with joy? Do we dance because we experience God's presence? When have we experienced God's presence with such great joy that it makes us want to dance? Perhaps it was at a summer camp during Vespers, watching the sunset over the lake, and overcome with an indescribable feeling of the beauty of the sunset, or perhaps the deep, still waters of the lake, or the words spoken by the worship leader, or the camaraderie of fellow campers, that God's presence was near and palpable. Perhaps it was during a conference ordination service in a church or an auditorium, when hundreds of people present were singing, "Guide me, O thou great Jehovah," and our hearts and voices rose as one in a glorious feeling of unity with each other and the divine. Perhaps it was during communion in a small country church, and the half-dozen people stood in a semicircle around the communion table, sharing bread and wine, and in the intimacy and the knowledge that wherever two or three are gathered together, God was there. Maybe these were mountaintop experiences for us, and like Moses knew that he was on holy ground when he stood in front of the burning bush, and so he took off his sandals. When have we had such a mountaintop experience that we knew we were on holy ground and figuratively wanted to take off our sandals? Surely David was having a mountaintop experience when he danced with the ark on its way to its new home in Jerusalem. Maybe though we're missing something important here. Maybe we are waiting and longing and expecting and yearning for mountaintop experiences, and maybe they never come. Or if and when they do, maybe they're not mountaintop experiences, they're just foothills. Or maybe they're like the Arrow River Hills in Manitoba, which Fran saw when she was there. And she kind of laughed because really they're just a geographic feature. They're drumlins, and they go for about 10 miles. And they're called the Arrow River Hills, and they're the 9th highest elevation in Manitoba. Who knew? So if and when we don't have mountaintop experiences, which we expect, and we only have foothills or Arrow River Hill experiences, then we're going to be disappointed, aren't we? So how are we to experience God's presence differently? Not only how can we think about this differently, how and where and when can we experience the divine in us and in our relationships? Our humanness tends to limit our imagination and our experiences, so that we associate God's presence with, well, the kind of stories that we share every Sunday before worship. Well, maybe that's not true, because some of those experiences that we share are kind of like mountaintop experiences. I think that If 750 of my closest friends were singing me happy birthday, that would kind of be a mountaintop experience. And it reminded me of a mountaintop experience that I had. Maybe it wasn't God presence, but it was, well, maybe it was. In the Ukrainian community, they sing Noya Lita, which is kind of a blessing. And it's a very great honor for people to sing that to you. And everybody stands, but the person that's being honored sits and doesn't sing. And one time I was at an event, and the MC decided that everyone should sing that song in my honor, and I'm not Ukrainian. That was a very special mountaintop experience for me. Our humanness tends to limit our imagination and our experience so that we associate being in God's presence when things are going well. And when things aren't going well, how can God be there? I believe that we all want to experience God's presence in our lives in some form or another, preferably in a tangible way, so that we experience it as real. How can this happen? How will it happen? When will it happen? A tourist in New York City asked, "How can I get to Carnegie Hall?" The answer was, practice, practice, practice. I think the musicians among us can appreciate that. If we want to experience God's presence in our lives, then there needs to be consistent practice that opens not just our minds, but also our hearts to feeling and experiencing God's presence in our lives. And that probably means setting aside a time every day where there is silence, to be open and to acknowledge God's presence that already dwells within us. David and the Hebrew people forgot about the ark. It was languishing with a farmer when David recovered it. And they forgot how to transport it. It was supposed to be carried by 6 men on poles. They forgot they couldn't touch it. Uzzah reaches out to touch it because it was going to fall over and he dies on the spot. What David remembered was that the ark contained Shekinah, from the Hebrew to dwell, meaning divine presence. And so he danced with joy as he accompanied the ark up to Jerusalem. We may have forgotten how to live in divine presence and with divine presence. With practice, though, we can feel God's presence in our hearts. We have a natural tendency, I have a natural tendency to live in the past. Some of us are storytellers. That's really about living in the past. And living in the future. I have a tendency to live in the future. That's called fantasizing. And we do almost anything to avoid the reality of the present moment. However, in addition to setting aside time every day for experiencing the light, as Quakers call God's presence, we can be attuned to feel God's presence in our lives at all times, not just during daily quiet time or during mountaintop experiences. And to do this, we need to live constantly in the present. We may associate God's presence with things that are good or pleasant. It's hard to imagine that God can be found in pain and in suffering. The psalmist said, "Tears may flow in the night, but joy comes in the morning." Our neighbor in Okanagan Center recently said, "When you pray regularly, the irregular happens more regularly." My mother used to say, "Don't worry, pray." When life's curveballs come at us hard and fast, when we can't cope, when illness strikes, God's presence is also there. After Uzzah died, David said, "How can I take the Ark of the Covenant with me now?" He left it with his friend Obed for 3 months. David did not give up his dream of taking the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem, though. He retrieved the Ark and continued the journey. He continued to celebrate God being in God's presence, and continued to celebrate, albeit with just trumpets this time. Father Richard Rohr says that most of us don't deal with or confront or get our spiritual lives in order until we are brought to our knees. The by illness or a death or divorce or losing a job. And sometimes that allows us to discover the God presence in spite of our suffering, or better yet, in the midst of our suffering. May we develop the practice of being in touch with God's presence in times we set aside. May we live in the present so that we can feel God's presence at all times. And may we be so open to God's presence in every situation in life that we can feel God's presence even in the midst of pain and suffering. Amen.
Amen.